The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. Professors in many different academic disciplines build and study models as part of our professional research. Some of these models are estimated on universities' powerful computers. These models might seem far removed from everyday life. Life as we know it changed dramatically in the past few months, with states ordering non-essential businesses to close and allowing 300 million Americans to leave their homes really essentially for only government-approved reasons. Almost 50 million people have filed unemployment claims, and the unemployment rate has risen to a level not seen since the Great Depression. These very real effects on our economy and lives have been driven to a very large extent by some academic models. In this case, the models of disease transmission in the field of epidemiology, a discipline that lies in the intersection of medical and social science. Economists are also social scientists, and we build and analyze many of our own models in our research. What are we to make of the epidemiological models that underlie government decisions that have so affected our lives? Joining me on EconVersations today to talk about these models is Dr. Phil Magness, an economic historian with the American Institute for Economic Research. Dr. Magness has a PhD in public policy from George Mason University, and he's published 5 books and dozens of articles on a range of topics. His most recently finished book was titled Cracks in the Ivory Tower, and is co-authored with Jason Brennan, and it examines scholarship in a range of different disciplines. So Dr. Magness brings an interdisciplinary perspective to these important questions. And he has the honor of being our first guest to appear remotely on the show today. Welcome to EconVersations, Phil.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's get started here with just tell us, if you can, a little bit about the structure of some of these different epidemiological models, and try to put it in terms that those of us who aren't economists or epidemiologists can understand.
Right. So epidemiology, as you mentioned, is a field that intersects between social sciences and medicine. So it has feet in both departments. And in doing so, it uses tools from both. And what epidemiologists attempt to do when they engage in models is to predict the trajectory of a disease. And that can include all the vital statistics that we've been seeing on the news, from hospitalization rates, number of cases that are anticipated to break out in the next few weeks to months. And then the one that we all really care about and have paid very close attention to is the fatality or death rates that are associated with the disease. And a good epidemiology model attempts to try and predict this and show us where we're going so we can make policy decisions as needed.
And one of the things about some of the epidemiological models is some of them use these categories or bins that I think are very informative, especially sort of to help us understand sort of the vulnerability that we, both in the United States and I think the entire world, faced here in 2020.
Right. And so one of the main models that comes out of epidemiology, they refer to it as an SIR model. And what it measures is the susceptibility of an individual to a disease, the number of people that are infected, the infection rate, and then you have a recovery or removal. Removal basically means someone dies of the disease from the whole population. So you can get all the different dimensions of how this disease filters through society. And there are modifications on this basic framework. But what the models attempt to do is you can take basic demographic data, data about what we know on how risky the disease is for infection, what's its transmissibility, what's its fatality rate, and plug it into a model. And theoretically, you could calculate how a disease, a pandemic, would filter through a society given the parameters that you know.
And I guess with a brand new virus or a brand new disease like this, one of the problems is that everybody's going to start in that susceptible category. So nobody's been able to be inoculated, nobody's had the virus before. Everybody was starting in that susceptible bin, if you want to speak, right?
Yeah, so everyone's starting in the susceptible bin, but also the parameters that we know about how it transmits within that segment of the population is basically an unknown for a
Hmm.
novel virus. The best we can do is compare it to historical examples of viruses that have had similar characteristics. So, respiratory illnesses, influenza viruses that we have from the
Hmm.
past are the common example there. And then coronavirus, we do have some very acute outbreaks, so like the SARS pandemic that happened about 2 decades ago. And then we also know basic coronavirus behavior because it's one of the major virus categories that fits into what we call the common cold. So there are some similarities, but there's not a precise knowledge at this point of how it transmits. So we're operating in like an information vacuum just to start off with because of the unknowns that are there.
And one of the things that I think you really got out of the models is that once a outbreak gets started, it can be it can take a while to like try and put the clamps on it or to do something about it from a policy standpoint. And it's a little bit like a battleship. Once it gets going, it's going to take a while to stop or turn. And that makes the forecasting really important in this case, right?
That is exactly it. Milton Friedman used an old analogy. It was to think about like a economic behavior. Imagine trying to steer the Titanic with a rudder that had a rubber band attached to it, and you pull it in one direction, you're going to get a very, very slow responsiveness. But by the time you have started to steer the ship, it's very difficult to correct the course if like an iceberg or something comes along. So you're very much operating in that type of a familiar scenario for those of us that work in economic forecasting.
Mm-hmm.
It also applies very closely in the epidemiological world.
Tell us a little bit about the use of models in economics, because a lot of times we go over models like we torment our students with the models that we try to make them learn, but we use them for a somewhat different purpose than necessarily forecasting, right?
Yeah. So the premise behind any model is to give an approximation of real world events. But necessarily, we must simplify an approximation of many real world events. And in economics, we have the basic supply and demand model in a partial equilibrium is to tell us something about how a good is traded, what it sells for, where consumers are responding to changes in the price for that particular good. So it's not something that translates necessarily in a direct one-for-one way of what you see on the shelves at Walmart, but it does conceptualize the type of behavior when someone goes into Walmart and decides to buy something. They're responsive to prices. They're responsive to what is going on in all the different signals that you can get from price data. So a model is a way to break down something that's very, very complex, has a multitude of variables, to kind of distill it to its core and tell us some basic information of what we can expect about behavior in response to things like price changes.
Okay, so that gives us a little bit of background here as to like the role of models. Now, in March, there was a study that came out from the United Kingdom that by all accounts was very influential in shaping policy both here in the United States and in the UK. So if you could tell us a little bit about this study, because I mean people have probably heard at least some of the numbers from some of the projections from this study quoted in the news.
Yeah, so this was probably the most important academic contribution to the coronavirus policy response so far. And that was back in March. A team of epidemiologists at Imperial College London, headed by this guy named Neil Ferguson. He's been all over the news both for his epidemiology advice and also he got into a little bit of trouble for breaking the lockdown over there. So there's a little bit of a public scandal, but he became kind of a household name. And what he did is he adapted an influenza model that he developed back in 2005, 2006 for one of the previous flu pandemics to the COVID-19 characteristics. So they import all of what at least was believed to be known at the time about COVID-19, and they run an agent-based simulation. And the agent-based simulation is constructed around what I mentioned, this SIR model about the susceptibility, infection, recovery, removal. And what they do is they'll take the parameters of a given country, a population. So he does it for the United States and Great Britain simultaneously in the paper they publish. But theoretically, you could use this for any country in the world as long as you've got data to input to it. And several countries have adapted it. But it runs a simulation based on assumptions about the number of times people in the general population interact with each other in the course of a given day. So you know that you go to work, you meet X number of colleagues in the course of the day. You maybe get on the bus for the ride home, interact with other people, and then you interact with people in your households. These are just basic types of social structures that we have, and based on some assumptions of how many times people cross paths with each other, each of those is an opportunity to transmit the disease. So you could theoretically, if you've got the correct parameters in place, you could theoretically run a model through an entire society based on its population data, and it would spit out on the other end of the model projections of how many people get infected, how long those infections last, and then ultimately how many people we can expect to die from the course of this pandemic. So that was the core of his paper. They run this simulation and they do it in repetition, so it's probabilistic. The number of interactions. Think of it as like a giant Sim City game, if you remember the old computer games of a fixed economy you were playing on your computer. Well, think of this as a fixed economy that you're running a pandemic through for society. And probabilistically, you can determine, the computer will guess how many people are infected, how many are not, and then you can take fatality rates and get a death estimate. So they run it several times in repetition, and the cumulative result of that, you can kind of converge around a mean, and that's what they report in the paper.
And in this paper, this is a paper that came out with a worst case estimate that got a lot of attention on the news, and it was a worst case estimate of 2.2 million deaths here in the United States. That certainly, I think, seemed to get the Trump administration's attention, right?
Yeah. So this was all over the news, if you remember back to mid-March. They released the paper. I think officially it came out on March 16th, although it had been circulating for a couple of days before that between the governments. In both the United States and in Great Britain, both President Trump and Prime Minister Boris Johnson came out right around that time and gave press conferences where they announced basically a really drastic shift in course of policy. Because there was a little bit of uncertainty before that. Some strategists were saying maybe we should cultivate herd immunity and let it play out through society. But with those two projections, so the 2.2 million deaths in the U.S. is a worst case scenario, and about 500,000 in Great Britain is a worst case scenario. That spurred the two governments into action, and they both basically said, we need lockdowns, we need them now. Boris Johnson imposed them as a national level. What Trump did is he issued an advisory through the CDC and all the medical channels to governors on responses that you can make to the coronavirus. And it basically influenced 42 out of 50 states to go into some sort of shelter in place, lockdown, shutdown scenario.
So this model was, as best as we can tell from not having been on the inside, it is clearly closely connected to the policy response that we observed.
Absolutely.
Now, the paper itself lays out lots and lots of different scenarios in there, and at some level, although they had this 2.2 million deaths as a worst case scenario, it was never, even in the paper's own terms, in some sense, a plausible worst case scenario. So if you can, tell us a little bit about what was behind this, because I think it's a relatively important point, and one that, at least as some economists, might see as a little bit objectionable with what they were putting forward here.
Exactly. So the model that they presented in the paper, they depict a series of scenarios, and the one that gets all the attention, of course, is 2.2 million deaths. The worst case scenario, that was what they claimed would happen if you let the virus run its course through society and basically do nothing. But then they say, here are all of these different interventions that you could do from a policy level. You can close schools, you can cancel events, and then ultimately the most extreme is the shelter in place or variants of that, although even the Imperial College didn't go quite as far as what most states did and their imposed policy. So we kind of took Imperial's recommendations and ran them on steroids when we adopted these shelter in place orders. But each of these different steps is supposed to reduce the number of social interactions that a given person does in the course of their day. So you rerun the model and it projects a lower number of infections and ultimately a lower number of deaths that's associated with it. The issue here, though, when you're presenting this very complex model to the public and a world that's driven by media and sound bites, which of the sound bites do you think the media highlights and portrays? It was all the extreme scenario, the disaster scenario of 2.2 million, even though the imperial paper itself says this is an unlikely scenario because we know governments are probably going to do something. We can get to the question about whether that's effective what they do. But the idea here was that the disaster scenario, the apocalypse one, the media was touting was probably never even realistic.
Yeah.
The problem here, though, yeah, we know that
because even the model had a scenario where they anticipate people were going to respond somehow. People weren't going to continue to go, even if we didn't cancel sporting events. Not everybody was still going to go to sporting events with a virus out there. Right.
Exactly. So people respond to just knowledge that the virus is out here. And I talk to people about coronavirus policy. One thing I always ask them is, when did you start carrying hand sanitizer in your car or in your pocket? And most people answer about late February, when they started hearing word of this virus that it had arrived in the United States. If you remember, there was an outbreak very early on in Washington State, a nursing home up there. Mm-hmm. And that's around the time that people started paying attention to it. That's also when they made their run on the stores and they started buying up all the Lysol and all the toilet paper and things that they thought they were going to need in this type of a scenario. But already consumer behavior is preceding the lockdown date. Yeah. So the earliest date that we get it recommended is March 16th. And I think California is the first state. It's 3 days later. And then over the next week or so, almost all states go into lockdown. But people had already been responding for weeks ahead of that.
And I think we know from some cell phone data that people reduced their travel more closer to like March 14th, a little bit before the lockdown orders went into place. Now, one of the problems is that the paper laid out all of these scenarios, and we adopted the policy. So that makes it, in some sense, inherently difficult to try to tell what would have happened if we hadn't adopted these policies. But Sweden, they ran a version of this model, as you mentioned. They've done it for some other countries. But Sweden, they laid out a version of this model, and Sweden didn't adopt the same kind of policies that the United States and the UK did. So tell us a little bit about what we saw there, and whether this worst case scenario seemed to have played out without government policy.
Yeah, so Sweden is the classic case of a natural experiment. You have a country with really good data that is in an area of a hotspot, an outbreak. Europe is very much a hotspot of the coronavirus, and yet they bucked the trend of what almost every other country in Europe did. And you can look at the UK, Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Spain. They all went into various stages of lockdown and did so relatively early on, especially cases like Italy and Belgium were some of the first movers. But they also had very severe outbreaks. Sweden said, we're going to take a milder course. We're going to advise people about the disease, tell them to voluntarily social distance, wash their hands, do all the basic steps that you would to protect yourself against a virus, but we're not going to shut down all schools. We're not going to order businesses to close. So you've got a natural experiment of very similar countries in roughly the same region playing out simultaneously. What happened is Sweden got a lot of backlash in late March and early April for not going along with the supposed consensus view that other developed economies were adopting. And that caused, there were some academics, they started saying, we're going to take the Imperial College model from the UK and let's run it for Sweden. We'll put in Sweden's parameters and see what we get. So there was a team at Uppsala University in Sweden that basically took the direct model from Imperial College, ran it for Sweden, and their conclusion was that Sweden needed to go into lockdown by April 10th to avoid the disaster scenario. And they gave specific dates of when the disasters would take place. So they said, we've got basically about a month's time. And if we don't do this, we're looking at a massive death toll. The Uppsala version of the Imperial College model for Sweden projected by June 1st, if they did absolutely nothing, somewhere in the neighborhood of 95,000 deaths. They said even the second scenario was if you adopted a UK or US style shutdown policy and put it in place by April 10th, you're still looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of about 40,000 deaths. So they said, because Sweden's behind the curve, this has already taken root. The best you can do now is try to play catch up with the lockdown, and you're still going to get hammered by this thing. Mm-hmm. Well, Sweden didn't deviate from its course. It kept the lighter touch policy in place. And 2 months later, when these projection dates were supposed to come through, where was Sweden sitting at? It was about 4,500 deaths. So less than a tenth of even the milder scenario that this model had projected, and nowhere near the disaster scenario. So what that tells me is that there are some basic faults of assumptions that went into the Imperial College model.
And one of the things that struck me reading examining this model was that when it came to the effects of these non-pharmaceutical policy interventions that they were recommending, that they assumed that they would have certain effects on the amount of interactions that people would have. But the evidence for the evidence for how much each of these interventions would have on interactions struck me as very sparse, because that would be the kind of thing where, as an economist, if I was putting together a model like this, I'd have to list 10 different references as to why this is a plausible argument, and there wasn't any of that there. And I guess it's a larger question of, we really don't know an awful lot about the effectiveness of a lot of these policies that we adopted.
Right. There's very little testing, and it's something that's really difficult to test because you can't randomize a test of an epidemic, how it plays out. But if you look into the model, they actually specify, they assume compliance rates with lockdowns. They assume reduction rates in social interaction if say we cancel schools, and then there's also an increase in social interactions if people are sitting at home with their own family. But if you look at this, there are all these nice round even numbers. They'll say, we assume we do this, there's a 75% reduction. We do this, there's a 50% compliance. We do this, there's a 20% increase. So it's not anything that's been tested. It's really just kind of guesstimates that they've hard-coded into the model. And if you do that, you're going to get the same result as a product of your guesstimation, rather than whether we know if these policies work or not. Mm-hmm. And then to add on top of that, if you go back to the original 2006 paper that Neil Ferguson based this model on, there's a striking concession in the second to last paragraph. He says, we do not know the effect of disease spread in residential communities, residential facilities such as long-term care nursing home facilities. We can't apply this model to nursing homes. Well, what do we know about the coronavirus? This has been in most states between 40 and 70% of all coronavirus deaths are in nursing homes. So the one thing that they admit that their parameters don't even have a means of accounting for is really the locus of the outbreak.
There were other models that were used by policymakers here in the United States, some from the University of Washington in Seattle. And many of these forecasts, especially the ones from University of Washington on numbers of hospitalizations and intensive care beds that would be necessary, were wildly off. So, I mean, is there some reason, especially coming from economics, where we might think well, it's just really hard to forecast?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, both of economics and then almost any other field where we attempt to do forecasting. It's a really imprecise scientific form. We have gotten to a point in economics where we can get very rough estimates of ranges of what's likely. Some of the best econometric models, and these are Nobel Prize winning models, so autoregressive techniques that come out of economics for projecting the macroeconomy. This was stuff that was done in the 1970s and 80s, has since been adapted to other fields, one of which is epidemiology. So that University of Washington model it draws on some autoregressive techniques. But what this means is it's taking existing data and it's constantly updating, constantly adjusting as the new data comes in and the parameters change. And what that means is the predictive ability of the model is also adjusting in real time. And what it was saying a month ago may no longer apply because the data has followed a different a different track. And next thing you know, the predictive ability of the model is greatly diminished to the point that you just simply are not getting anywhere near the type of certainty you'd need to make a claim that we need to impose this policy now, that we can fine tune to a specific date. So this is something I think economists, even for all our faults and difficulties in forecasting, have realized the imprecision of the tools that we have at a faster rate than many other disciplines. So that they're almost lagging a couple decades behind where economics was. So I use the analogy, if you go back to the 1950s, what did the econometric modeling approaches that were adopted by the field in its early days attempt to do? Well, they attempted to mechanistically forecast the macroeconomy. They called it hydraulic Keynesianism at the time. They thought that the entire economy of a country could be operated by a system of valves and levers. So you cut taxes here, you alter the interest rate here, you inject a fiscal stimulus here, and these would be the outputs of it. So it's all these little levers and triggers and events that are built into an attempt to systematize the entire economy. But what we found out is you can get nowhere near that level of precision. So all of these mechanistic models from the 1950s were just basically abandoned by economics as a field to try to move to something that has a much broader bands of information that you're trying to account for. And what that means is you get much less precise predictions, and predictions that are also constantly changing, which is not a very well-suited tool to making very fine-tuned, precise policy decisions. So I think, at least in an epistemic humility sense, a typical economist would say we can get predictions that allow us to maybe anticipate where things are going, but it would be an error to state with certainty that a given policy is going to give this yielded outcome that we think our model is predicting. And yet in epidemiology, that's essentially what they're asserting.
Well, we've just got a couple minutes left here, but one thing I want to touch on here sort of to wrap up is that it seems like, Dr. Anthony Fauci and our public health experts have, if anything, had a lot to say about policy making. It really sort of almost to the point of it, at times it seems like we now face this like public health dictatorship where our policy is being dictated by the public health experts. We see this sort of in our own lives when going to our own doctors and the advice that doctors give us. I mean, both as an individual level and then maybe more importantly from a society level. How do we handle this danger of falling into being dictated to by the experts? How do we keep ourselves in charge of setting the values?
Right. So I worry about this, that handing the keys of the economy over to experts, medical experts, it's a very undemocratic way of approaching governance. And if you think about it, there was not much public conversation about the prudence of lockdowns. These were basically plans that came out of bureaucracies and were built around older epidemic models and epidemic predictions that were basically implemented by edict from the top down. That really worries me for a free society, if that can even be compatible for the long term. And actually, if there's any comparison to make, think about the reaction to terrorist events, so 9/11, or think about the Iraq War. There were emergency powers invoked associated with all those things to implement policies that were not democratically debated, but were considered by the exigency of the moment. We're doing kind of the same thing here with epidemiology. And the risk here is it invites hubris. It invites expertise to assert beyond what it can realistically claim to have knowledge of. So another way of thinking of it is like you have governance by SimCity, a giant computer model that really doesn't tell us with the certainty we need or we would desire, versus a Hayekian knowledge problem of information cost imposed humility. And these two things are in direct tension with each other, and yet you're getting policies that maybe have a very high margin of error if we make a miscalculation or we recommend the wrong thing for unjustified reasons.
Okay, well, thanks very much for talking about this. Thanks for coming on, and thanks for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.
Absolutely.